Clear prop.
Star 73, Yankee number 2, following twin traffic, 3 mile final, clear Sutton. 1 Charlie Bravo, exit in runway 25, going 4 mile final.
This is Behind the Prop with United Flight Systems owner and licensed pilot Bobby Doss and his co-host, Major Airline Captain and designated pilot examiner Wally Mulhern. Now let's go Behind the Prop.
What's up, Wally?
Hey, Bobby, how are you?
I am fantastic. This week is something that I think as instructors, as teachers, as flight school owners and DPs, we talk about it a lot, and I'm not sure how much it's put into practice, but we are talking about personal minimums today, and something every pilot should have, something that I think we all have for what I'll call the top 5, maybe fuel, weather, crosswinds, those sorts of things. But we're going to dive into some thoughts and maybe have some chats and talk about maybe what some personal minimums are for us and maybe what others should be thinking about as it relates to those personal minimums. So we're going to break it up into 2 parts. We'll talk VFR and then we'll talk more IFR type stuff afterwards. But the ALPA is a great organization. We've had Pat Brown on the show many times. The ALPA has 2 PDF contracts that you can write with yourself that really articulate and define your personal minimums. I think it would be a great practice to go through those and update those on a regular basis, even up and down. So maybe you don't fly as regularly as you once flew. Maybe you need to turn your personal minimums down, and maybe you're super proficient and fly a lot of IFR, and maybe you could turn those personal minimums a little bit tighter that give you lower minimums, blah, 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 to help you be a better, safer pilot no matter what stage in your career of piloting you're in. What do you do with an applicant, Wally, that comes in and flies with you and they pass that check ride? Do you talk personal minimums much with them?
Yeah, we do. And first of all, let's talk about personal minimums. We all have personal minimums in life, and we don't even think about it. I have a friend that's an avid cyclist. He said he doesn't get out on the bicycle if it's below 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Okay?
Smart man.
Yeah. Well, that's a personal minimum. Okay, we're not even thinking about it. There may be a restaurant down the road that you drive by and you'd like to go to it one day, but you've heard it's $50 for an entree, so you don't go there. Well, that's a personal minimum. You're saying, yeah, that's above my ability to pay for it.
I also won't go there if there's 47 people standing outside the front door.
Well, that's another thing. Exactly. Yeah. Hey, let's meet at restaurant A, but restaurant B doesn't have anybody. Well, let's divert and go over to restaurant B. So we all have personal minimums in life. I mean, I think when we go to buy a product, we're going to buy a car. We have a budget in mind. Okay. So that's a personal minimum. So this is really nothing new, but just how we apply it to our flying career, and again, we're going to start talking about VFR flying. So I always ask the applicant, what is your personal minimum? And when we say personal minimums, most of the time we think of weather. Okay, well, the weather needs to be a ceiling of X and a visibility of Y, and maybe a wind of Z. Also think about your fuel. I will ask them, I'll say, okay, how much fuel are we going to land with when we get to our destination? And they'll say, okay, they'll usually give it to me in gallons. And I'll say, okay, well, gallons means nothing to me. Let's convert that gallons to minutes. How many minutes are we going to land with? And we do the conversion, and we'll come up with, say, okay, we're going to land with 120 minutes worth of fuel. Okay, good. Well, what is your personal minimum? And I usually get a little bit of a head scratch. I would say most people don't have it just on the tip of their tongue. Most of them have to think about it. And they'll come up with, more times than not, 60 minutes is a personal minimum that I hear a lot. And there's nothing wrong with that. If that meets the FAR, and then you're good. So I'll say, okay, so in this case where we're landing with 120 minutes and your personal minimum 60 minutes, we have 60 minutes worth of buffer in there. We've got 60 minutes worth of messing around that we can do. If we get we have to divert around maybe a TFR or something, and we're going to add 30 minutes to our flight. Well, 60 minutes minus 30 minutes, we're down to 30 minutes of buffer. So we'll talk about that, and I'll usually put them in a scenario where we are now going to land with 58 minutes worth of fuel. And a lot of times they'll say, the applicant will say, yeah, well, that's fine.
What?
And I'll say, well, wait a minute. You just told me your personal minimum was 60. We're landing with 58. So is your personal minimum really 60, or is it 60-ish?
Well, it's somewhere between 60 and the FAR, what the regulations say, Wally.
Right. So you have to say, well, what is it? What is your minimum?
Yeah, and I think I struggle with that, right? I think I may have told the story before, but a long time ago when I was newly minted, a friend of mine wanted to take his wife to Galveston. I wanted to take him to Galveston. We planned this thing out weeks in advance, right? And we're scheduled to go at 4 p.m., noonish. They have to drive about an hour to get to the airport. Noonish, we're looking at the weather. It's 2,000 feet overcast. And I'm like, man, my personal minimum is like 3,000. But today I'll make it 2,800. If it's 2,800, we'll go. That's my go, no-go, 2,800. So we watch it. It's warming up. It's the middle of summertime. It was going to be plenty hot to get this moisture out of the air, I kept saying. And 2,000 feet became 2,200 and 2,400. And at 2,400 feet, I'm thinking, man, one more ATIS. It became 2,500. I said, all right, y'all drive down here. And I just felt the pressure that I had to get them on this trip. So 25, they're driving up with 25, and I'm driving to the airport myself to pre-flight, and I'm thinking, is it 25 or 28? And what wasn't it 3,000 this morning when I woke up? Like, why am I doing this to myself? What if anything happens? I'll never forgive myself. And lo and behold, it gets to 2,800. We end up flying at about the corridor, which is not the safest place to fly. The corridor is kind of crystal clear. It had all broken up and kind of gone away. So I got lucky, though. It wasn't like my personal minimums drove the right decision for me. It was more about luck in that instance. And I was pretty frustrated with myself, and I've tried to stay more rigid since that point. That could be 3 other episodes about external pressures and making go, no-go decisions. But in that situation, I was super proficient flying, but I wasn't IFR rated. And it wouldn't have been much to be unlucky and for all that to come down on top of me and put me in a really bad situation.
Right.
With no real good place to land, with not the training that I needed to fly IFR, and 2 passengers who really entrusted me to be the good pilot that I should have been and make better decisions, right?
Right.
As a flight school owner, I think of personal minimums in a little different light probably than you do as a DPE. I'm thinking, how proficient are these people at flying and renting my aircraft? You know, the FAA has some rules. We have our own rules that are a little bit tighter than that. But I have a number of customers that like to rent about every 86 or 7 days. And this weekend, I got to deal with one of those. I got to talk to one. The aircraft he was going to fly had a maintenance issue earlier in the morning, and we had to swap planes. And as I looked at their reservation history, they didn't have a lot of time in the aircraft that they needed to move into. They actually had 0 time in that aircraft, albeit very similar to some other aircraft. And we had a new employee working up front, and I had a CFI that was standing up front. I called the CFI and I said, look, I need you to talk this guy out of flying. Like, I don't care what his personal minimums are. We need to make sure he doesn't go fly a plane he's never flown before. And sure enough, we had a good conversation. I talked to the gentleman on the phone, and the stressors for him were, well, if I don't fly in the next 4 days, it's going to be really expensive to get current. And I'm always wondering what that really means, Wally. Like, is $59, $75 more money than what it means to be proficient or current? And I think that external pressure of the 90 days landing 3 times to a full stop to be able to take passengers is a stressor that it shouldn't be as important as we make it out to be, right? If you don't fly every 88 days, are you really proficient to take passengers?
Yeah.
If you flew 4 times, 12 laps in the pattern in the last 12 months, would it be smart to go on a long cross country with 3 people in the back of an aircraft?
I would think not.
So I think the personal minimums around how often you fly is really the one that I think about the most. And I don't necessarily need you to rent from here, but we do have rules about renting from here. You can't just say I rent everywhere else and I'm proficient. You have to fly here on a regular basis. But what do you think? What do you think? You being 25,000 hour man, and me not. What do you think the right number of hours for a 75-hour private pilot would be to fly per 30 or 90 days to be proficient?
I'd say 2 hours a month. I'm just making something up.
We have not planned this, but that's good. I mean,
Yeah.
I would say 6 hours a quarter. That's fairly good.
Yeah.
That's not just my 3 landings for sure, right?
Right.
I should be out doing some maneuvers of some sort.
Yeah.
I every time I fly with an instructor, I say, before we finish today, make me do a few slips because I don't do them on my own, and I
Right.
just don't like being that uncoordinated low to the ground. So challenge me on that, right?
Right,
I think that's important to do, to make sure you hold yourself accountable and hold your flying accountable to being able to do those maneuvers that you could do on check ride day.
And I think it's important. Most of the airplanes we have, most of them have some sort of a GPS. It's important, to not just stay in the pattern and do touch and goes, to get out of the pattern and utilize the installed equipment. Learn how to play around with the GPS. Head out on a nice VFR day, and if you took it upon yourself that said, boy, I'm going to make myself learn one new feature of the GPS every time I fly. By the end of the year, you're a better pilot because there are tools within those GPSs, the nearest airport function, which most people are pretty good about it now, but I think it's something that we as the instructor community have gotten better on, because 3-4 years ago, I don't think we were very good at that. Okay, we're flying along, we got a problem, we need to divert, and people are looking on their sectional to find the closest, which is fine, that works too, but it's in a GPS, a nearest airport function.
That is an interesting one, because maybe I should have personal minimums on how well I know that equipment for both day and night. And how well can I do without that equipment? Because if I'm so dependent on the other end of that spectrum, if I'm so dependent on that, will I fly a plane that doesn't have the GPS? Nowadays there's a almost need for some people to fly a G1000 aircraft, and it's a little scary to me that if they don't have that whiz bang display, that they might not be able to fly as proficiently as they do without it, right?
Yeah.
And I think the default standard that we all think about is I got to be smart and trained to go up to the G1000. But what if I've never flown a steam gauged aircraft?
Yeah.
And I've got 200 hours in a G1000. That's a very interesting flight if they get in a steam gauge aircraft and go take off.
Yeah.
They don't know where to look.
And I've given check rides to many people, and in advanced stages. I mean, I instrument and commercial. And we may be in a G1000 airplane, and I will ask him, I'll say, have you ever flown a steam gauge airplane? I'll never forget one young man I asked, it was a commercial check ride. And I said to him, I says, have you ever flown a steam gauge airplane? And his response was, no, but I'd really like to do that one day. And his response sounded like me saying, boy, I'd really love to fly a biplane someday. The way he was talking, and very possible.
Like they're elusive.
Yeah. He could go his whole career and never fly a steam gauge airplane. It's possible.
Nowadays, I guess it is, right? It's very unlikely, because I think you're going to get a gig, or you're going to have an opportunity to fly some job in an aircraft that's not that decked out. Yeah. But I would say you should, and if you don't, I think you need to have some personal minimums around that, right? Like I need to fly with an instructor 3 or 4 hours before I fly solo in a steam gauge aircraft or something similar to that.
I just at my airline, I'm switching airplanes. I'm moving to a 777, and I flew my last flight on an airplane that has steam gauge airplanes. We have one aircraft type in the fleet that has some steam gauges, not the primary display, but over on the side, and that's the 757 and 767. I flew my last flight on it. So if things keep going well with the airline industry, I'll never fly another steam gauge airplane at the airline.
I was going to say, come on, Wally,
Yeah.
you will. The next
Yeah.
check ride, you'll have those steam gauges in it. Still VFR, still early in the personal minimums checklist. Like, what about recurrent training? We all have to do a flight review. Occasionally, I'll see on Facebook someone post something like, "Where's the cheapest, shortest flight review I can get in town?" And I'm not sure that's the flight review you necessarily want, but I just did a flight review, and it was more than an hour of ground and more than an hour of flight. And I'm fairly proficient in the grand scheme of things. I just kept asking questions. The person that was doing my flight review was our assistant chief. He's been on the show, Gio, and he kept sharing stuff that was making me a better pilot. Why would I stop?
Right.
Maybe I have an advantage because I own a flight school and I know these guys, and I don't have to pay for the plane that I'm using, but trust me, I paid for the plane that I'm using. But it's not about the cost as much as it is proficiency in my mind, and I wanted to be more proficient.
I have a question that I'll ask. I need to have a heart valve replacement. Does anybody know the cheapest doctor for a heart valve replacement? Of course, I'm being facetious. I don't need a heart valve replacement, but think about that. If you went in and the doctor said we need to have a heart valve replacement, I don't think we shop around for that.
No,
I think we
give
go,
me the best.
And now you can say, well, I probably have health insurance, and it's probably not going to be money out of my pocket, but that's kind of what we're doing with flight training. You don't want to shortchange it. Just find a place that you're comfortable with. And again, you may be very proficient at flying. You may fly a lot. You may fly professionally, and you still need that flight review. For most people who do fly professionally, at least with an airline, there's some sort of annual training where every 6 months, maybe a year. At my airline, it happens to be every 9 months. We're in the simulator for some sort of recurrent training. And that all counts as a flight review. So me in my flying career, I have never had a traditional flight review. But it's not something you want to shortchange.
Not at all. And so that begs the question, is once every other year enough? And I don't know that it is. I think the Wings program from the FAA is a great program that goes underutilized. And I think it's because of cost. People think, well, a flight review is more economical than doing 2 or 3 flights with my instructor to stay proficient in the Wings program. But you're talking about you're doing that flying anyway. Get an instructor to go along with you and log the appropriate lessons so that you can get Wings credit and maybe get a set of wings in the process. It's all about more recurrent training and having someone in that cockpit that knows the GPS better than you, that can teach you something. Having someone in the cockpit that is more proficient with their scan and instrument weather that can point out some tips for you. And then I think we all know the PAVE checklist, but we should have our personal minimums with PAVE and how well do I feel today. I'm sure there's days where we've all flown and we weren't in our best of shape, whether that be mentally, physically. Hopefully none of us have done anything really crazy, but I'm sure I've flown a little more tired than another time that I've flown, and maybe a little bit fatigued of some sort. I probably could have ate something better before I got in that cockpit, but I think that you need to have a scale of, in this condition, I will not fly. In this condition, I will fly. There needs to be a gray, not a non-gray line, but a black line of where do I need to be feeling mentally and physically before I strap on that airplane and go somewhere.
I know with the airline, we have what's called fit for duty, and before we can even download our paperwork for our flight, we have to certify that we are fit for duty.
That means that I feel good enough today to get in that cockpit?
Yeah.
That's an interesting thing. I think we should all do that. Maybe have a checklist for ourselves. Obviously, PAVE is out there, but have something that says, I'm going to declare that before I start thinking about going to the airport today.
All right.
I think we all do weather. Weather's probably the more easy one, but I would challenge the listeners to say, how gray is that line? If you say when I was a student training, I would write the winds in my logbook every time as almost a data point for me to know, hey, I've landed in 8 knots of crosswind, and I know that it was 8 knots from 280, so that I know what it was like from the right side, and I know what it was like coming from the left side, and that I've challenged myself in all these situations because I didn't want to go take off in something that I wasn't proficient in. But today, I'm not going to take off in 10 knots of crosswind. That's just, there's multiple reasons, but the big one being I don't need to go fly. I don't have to do this trip today ever. We could argue no one has to do any trip ever. But if I'm thinking I'm going to Austin to pick up my daughter, I have 2 really good options, flying and driving. And if flying's out, driving's not that much worse. So 10 knots is kind of my number. Is that gray? Not really. I mean, I'm not going to take off. Now, if I went and flew a lot in 10 knots, that might change for me. But I just don't fly regularly enough in 10 knots or even 8 knots to feel good about it. Would I do 8 knots today? Yeah, I think I would. I don't think that's beyond my skill set. 500-hour pilot who's landed in a lot of crosswinds, I think I can handle that. What about 8 knots of crosswind when it's 11 gusting 20? Probably a different story because I don't know that I've done it in that level of gust factor in a while. And so probably 8 and gusting is not in my personal minimums. Does that all make sense? Does that sound like I'm trying to make myself a safe pilot in my contract there, Wally?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the other one that's in the AOPA documentation is visibility and ceiling. And I think as an instrument pilot, that change as a proficient, newly minted IPC instrument pilot, those don't come into play as much because if I'm flying IFR, I have a new set of rules we'll talk about in a minute. But under VFR, I'm not going to take off in anything that's not marginal. And if it's marginal, it's got to have to be a real good reason why I'm getting in it. And I'm probably planning on ultimately filing a flight plan if I take off in marginal weather. But I feel safe. But if you don't have an instrument rating, you don't have that training done, I think you need to have a hard, fast line. It's 3,000 feet. It's 2,500 feet. And you just don't break it. Don't let those external pressures get you like they got me early on in my career.
Yeah, and this is going to almost sound like I'm going against everything that we're talking about. But what I would encourage is with a newly certificated instrument pilot, I give check rides to so many people because usually at the end of the check ride I'll say, now what? Now what are you going to do with this? And many instrument pilots will tell me, and this is the typical pilot who's getting an instrument pilot who's not a career path pilot. In other words, he's not using this to become a professional pilot, but maybe a private pilot who's got 600-700 hours and says, hey, I want to be a safer pilot, so I'm going to go ahead and get my instrument rating. A lot of times they'll tell me, oh, I have no intention of ever flying in a cloud. Well, geez, that's I say, geez, you need to do that. You need to fly in a cloud. You need to know what it's like because they say, well, I'm just doing it to be safer. And I would say, well, I think to be safer, you need to be proficient, and you need to keep that proficiency level up. So at some point, you need to get out there and fly in a cloud.
Yeah, it erodes pretty quickly, and I think it's one of those things that for me was a progression. So I did quite a bit of real instrument meteorological condition flying with an instructor, and then I got my instrument rating, and I tried to fly my first IFR flight plan on a clear day. My second IFR flight plan was on a broken day, and broken by meaning broken 5,000, and I was flying at 5,000 ish feet, right? So it was right there at the line. And then it was broken 3,000, and the clouds were 3,000 to 5,000. So I was going in and out, in and out, in and out. And then I flew in something where I flew probably 30 minutes by myself with passengers that weren't pilots for, in soup-like, cloud-like conditions for 30 or so minutes. It wasn't like just because I got my rating, I went and flew in the soup all the way to Austin. That just wouldn't have been logical. Yeah. And the only way that you can continue to be proficient is to do it. And if you don't feel comfortable or it's outside your personal minimums, go do it with an instructor. I mean, they're going to help you be safe.
It's no different from driving. I mean, I think Bobby and I have both raised young kids who have gotten a driver's license, and we live here in Houston, Texas. The day our kids got their driver's license, we didn't hand them the keys to the car and say, drive to downtown Houston. We'll see you later. No, I mean, you just kind of stay in the neighborhood for a while, and then you branch out a little bit. You fly on the clear days, and then you fly on the 5,000 broken day, the 3,000 broken day, the 3,000 overcast day. You work up to these things, and now our kids, I think, are perfectly competent to fly to drive to downtown Houston, where it involves getting on an interstate and all that kind of stuff. So,
yeah, the other one for VFR is really airport runway width and length. I think for those of us that fly to this airport, we get kind of the best of both worlds. We have a small runway and a big runway. But when you do your flight planning, and I've not gone to too many really small airports, but I went to a place just north of Austin called Spicewood. You ever been to Spicewood, Wally?
No, but I've seen it on the sectional.
So Spicewood is an interesting in the hill country airport, in the hills, not mountains, but in the hills. And you're kind of coming down a slope and then over a set of trees. We practice this 50-foot obstacle all the time, but you're coming in over this almost 50-foot obstacle with a bunch of houses around you. So you're coming down this slope, which is a little bit deceiving visually, into a runway that's 50 feet wide and about 3,000 feet long. So it's a little bit like the small runway here, but it's got a lot of stuff around it. It's more like almost like a Giddings that's really, really tiny, right? And so I went there, I planned there, I knew everything about the airport, I knew their fueling, I talked to the airport manager even, but I don't think I took into consideration necessarily everything that was around the airport. I mean, it had a similar runway, so I figured I'm good. But I went around on my first pass because I got a little slow and I thought this is not good, I'm just going around. But I think we all need to have some ideas on what are our thresholds. I would not go land on a short field, like a real short field somewhere. I'm talking 1,500 feet. I ain't doing it.
Right.
And I might be able to do that here, land within the 1,000-footers, but I'm not going to go do that in the woods somewhere where I have to be really, really proficient in my short field techniques.
Yeah. And for the most part, we're pretty spoiled. I mean, when you think about it, most of the runway lengths that we deal with are, we probably don't see anything less than 3,000 feet anywhere.
Right.
For the most
well, that's
part.
why I won't land short, because I don't do it on a regular basis.
Right.
And it's something to think about. Never mind an unimproved surface. I've never landed on a grass strip, and while one day I might aspire to do that, I ain't doing it unless I have a plan and somebody that's going to go with me to do it.
Right.
Nighttime is an interesting one. Do you fly at night? Do you fly at night alone? Are you proficient at night? Will you fly at night in a single engine? I think I hear a lot of people saying that's some really dangerous flying, and there are different risks and consequences to nighttime flying. But I'm not adverse to flying at night. Houston's a little different because there's so many airports and so much light. It's not necessarily even nighttime around here normally. But those things you need to set for yourself. And then I think you need to ask yourself some of the other questions that probably don't come up as regularly on these forums, but they are on this forum. Will I fly without a GPS? Will I fly without an electronic flight bag? We all have the scare tactic of a DPE turning my iPad off and saying, now what? But would you fly without your ForeFlight subscription being turned on? Would I fly without traffic today? I'm not sure I would fly without traffic. I have the luxury of it being on my G1000 screen and on my leg, my knee board. I don't know that there's any reason to go without traffic if you don't have to nowadays either, right? So some of those things you should think about and make sure you're writing on a contract and holding yourself accountable. And if you take a lot of time off, maybe you tighten those up quite a bit and make them a little bit more restrictive so that you can be a safer, better pilot. Now let's jump over to IFR. Some more strenuous things that I think you got to think about, right? And I think I had one of the best challenges ever at this flight school when I was a student. I walked in. It was probably the January timeframe. I was going out to just fly for fun and practice. The ceilings were around 4,000 feet, overcast. I wasn't planning on getting that high. And the chief instructor at the time happened to be here. She was up front, and she said, "Do you know the freezing levels?" And I was like, "Well, no, it's not freezing." I was probably 40 degrees, but she was testing me. I know she was testing me, and I have used the similar test over and over again. The standard lap rate being 2 degrees Celsius, that's only got to get to 4,000 feet where the moisture was. Had that dropped and the temperature dropped, what does that mean? It means freezing's now 3,000, could be 2,000. I wasn't an instrument-rated pilot, but I do think you have to understand what are your limits. How far below freezing are you willing to fly?
All right.
Are you willing to fly in visible moisture if there's any freezing in the area, right? Even if it's 5,000 feet above you, you could have super cold droplets falling on you that may do crazy things to that aircraft, right?
Yeah.
So with IFR minimums, your personal minimums, I think you got to be a lot more strict. And I've just become a guy who's not going to fly in cold weather. I'm like your cyclist friend. If it's not 40 degrees at 5,000 feet, I'm not going. And that's because I don't like to be cold. But recently I took myself out of the game because I had not done any instrument flying in so long. I had a trip planned to go pick up my daughter in Austin. It was overcast at 4,000. I chose not to fly low the whole way over there. And when I didn't take that flight, I was like, you know what? I'm not proficient. If I'm not going to fly in that, I'm not going to fly until I have my IPC done again. And that's what I chose to do. So I did an IPC. I did better than I thought I was going to do during my IPC. I feel confident. I've shot a bunch of approaches in an aircraft, in the simulator, with the CFI, challenged a bunch of different ways, doing my holds, and I feel really confident that I can fly in it again. But I think that's what you have to do at some point, is also say, I'm so unproficient that I'm not doing any instrument rating flying.
Right. It's like anything else. If I'm a big basketball fan. We've had Rockets season tickets for a long time, and they have all kinds of promotions at Rockets games, and a lot of times they'll invite someone to come down to make try a half court shot, and if you make it, you win a car or something like that. Boy, if I had advance notice that I was going to be, if they called me up and said, "Hey, we picked you for the half court shot tomorrow night's game," you don't think I'd be out on a basketball court
trying a granny shot style?
First of all, I'm probably not going to win the car, but I just don't want to embarrass myself. I don't want to I don't want to have all these people in the stands yelling airball at me. So it's the same thing. If anytime you're going to do something, you're going to practice it, and we should take that same philosophy with flying.
I agree. I think fuel reserves might change for some people. For me, it's an hour either way. And the only thing I might have a gray line on there is I might make it more if I have a bunch of headroom in my fuel tanks, right? If I'm flying 2 hours somewhere and I'm going by myself, then I'm going to land with whatever I have. I'm going to fill those tanks up. I'm not going to fly lighter for any reason over there for sure. I think that my recurrent training is obviously something that I take seriously, and I just recently did that. I think my new rule is I'm going to do an IPC every year, no matter whether I need it or not, whether I'm current or not. I just learned so many things from Geo in my last one that weren't necessarily all brand new techniques, but they were techniques that I hadn't tried or practiced in a while. And that was a lot of GPS stuff. We did a lot of G1000 stuff in the aircraft and in the sim. How to load a hold that's not published. How to fly the hold, and then autopilot go out on you. Are you really flying, or are you just sitting there watching it do all that work? And he was a wizard with the G1000, loading Victor Airways and all these other things that I'd never done and probably didn't know to do when I got my instrument rating, but made my tool bag much more valuable to me. And so I just think I'm going to do it every year, no matter what now. And then I think what's interesting about the IFR document from the AOPA is it's got the weather minimums and those things that you need to work with a flight instructor and be proficient before you set all those. But it has, just like the VFR one, but we didn't talk a lot of detail about it, is the I will section. I will get a full weather briefing every time I fly in instrument conditions. I will make sure my EFB is charged and with me on this flight. Those sorts of things become a big deal if you are so used to them that you set those rules that I will do these things before I fly, and make sure that you don't cut any corners, because being uncomfortable at 5,000 feet in the soup is not going to be really fun.
Yeah.
No matter what.
Yeah, there's an old saying, I'd rather be on the ground wishing I was in the air than in the air wishing I was on the ground.
And I try to explain that to student pilots in the lobby at this flight school a lot, right? No reason to take risks, no reason to push those personal minimums when you're not that proficient. So with that, go work with your CFI, your flight school, find someone to help you. Tell your wife, tell your girlfriend, tell your spouse, your boyfriend, your family member, these are my personal minimums. I'm not going to do anything that would jeopardize my safety. I'm going to be a safe pilot, and I am going to stay behind the prop.
Thanks for checking out the Behind the Prop podcast. Be sure to click subscribe and check us out online at BehindTheProp.com. Behind the Prop is recorded in Houston, Texas. Creator and host is Bobby Doss. Co-host is Wally Mulhern. The show is for entertainment purposes only and is not meant to replace actual flight instruction. Thanks for listening, and remember, fly safe.